Hello, Geoffrey. Good to see you. Thank you for joining me.
Hello, good morning. Nice to see you.
So, can you tell us a bit about your journey into Quakers then? What led you to Quakers? What were you looking for, and what did you find?
It's a probably a bit of a long story that because I have to go back quite a long way. I went to a school for Anglican clergy, for the sons of Anglican clergy.
Oh, right.
And the number of people I was at school with who've ended up as priests and bishops is really quite alarming. Uh, and I didn't end up as one of them. When it was quite heavy going really, and when I left, I mean, I think I was quite religious in a fairly sort of desultory way. But when I left school, I sort of hung it all up on a peg and left it there, and I didn't think about it at all, not at all. And I went to university and didn't think about it at all, and I ended up going into show business. And I was a showbiz professional till I was in my very late 50s when I retired to do more for Quakers. I'd become a Quaker by then. Um, I I got to the age of, I suppose, 44, 45, so about 30 years ago, 75 now. So yeah, it would be about 30 years ago. I had a bit of a crisis. Um, and as part of this, I had, I experienced, I don't know, I'm really reluctant to be specific about this because I don't want to pretend something happened that didn't happen. But I had what I think was a peak experience, I think. But
Mm.
it's very hard. It's virtually sort of indescribable. It lasted a long time. It lasted days and days and days, and I couldn't get away from it, and it kept me awake at night. And I found that really difficult. I mean, spiritual experiences are supposed to be, light glancing through stained glass windows and waves crashing on shores and sunsets and sunrises and all. None of it. None of it. It was very difficult. Um, I had this absolute necessity. It wasn't an urge, even. It was a necessity to say thank you for my life. I don't mean I don't mean a gratitude list. I mean a real burning need to give thanks. Uh, which was odd because I was probably emerging from a depression actually, but that was my urge, and so well, I went back to the Anglican church of my childhood because this was religious. I knew it was religious, but I didn't know much about it. And I went back to the Anglican church of my childhood, and that didn't fit. I
Mm.
knew that didn't fit. I was in London at the time and I went to Buddhist meditation classes. They were in Covent Garden. And I went down there and there was a monk turned up on a bike, late always with the key. And he told us, there were a little knot of us of about, I suppose, six, eight people at lunch times. And he told us what we were to do. And he told us about Buddhist meditation. And it was absolutely terrific. But I knew it wasn't for me.
Mm. Mm.
Um, I can't tell you exactly what wasn't for me, except that my ankles hurt. The kneeling for the meditation, I found uncomfortable. I mean that would have been fine in the end. That wasn't a reason not to do it, but I started to think that there was going to have to be something else, even though I'd been quite optimistic about it at the beginning. I suppose I did it for about, I don't know, somewhere between 6 and 10 weeks. I wouldn't like to say exactly.
Mm.
um, 2.5 months, 3 months, something like that. And what happened was that I was driving to a job. The job was every day for 3 weeks, I think. And I was driving to this job that happened to go through Hampstead, and there was a traffic jam in the same place every day, as there always is in Hampstead. And to my left in this traffic jam every day for 21 days was this Quaker meeting house with this Quaker poster. And it was a quote on it, which I didn't understand to start with. It was just a quote. It was a period I've been told since. I was very grateful for this poster, and I found out about it. Um, and apparently there was an economy drive. They couldn't afford to do any new posters, but they had to. So they just put quotes on posters and hope for the best. And this quote was Sidney Bailey, who was a Quaker who did a Swarthmore lecture. And it's a quote from his Swarthmore lecture. His Swarthmore lecture in the printed edition is called "Peace is a Process." And this quote was, "Peace is a process to engage in, not a goal to be reached." What I understood from that was peace is not a goal to be reached. And I found that was really interesting. I sat and I looked at that day after day. I looked at
Mhm.
this thing on my left there. I looked at it and I thought that's very good because the goal to be reached is world peace, or it's big things way over on the horizon that you can't quite reach and you know you never will, and you know people are paid to do it and they can't do it either. So I thought it was really interesting that it wasn't, but I didn't understand peace is a process to engage. I didn't understand that
Mhm.
for probably half a week at least. And I thought, that's interesting. I ought to look into these people. And then I did nothing about it. And I suppose at the end of the 3 weeks, somewhere around the end of the 3 weeks, I looked up Quaker in the phone book. But this was 1993 or something like that. Three, four. And Quaker in the phone book, you should have looked up Religious Society of Friends. There was only one thing under Quaker in the phone book, which was Quaker Bookshop.
Oh,
And I thought, they've got a bookshop. I'm a born researcher. So I went, I went down, I legged it down to this, Kremlin-esque building opposite Euston Station, which in those days had a rather dark, dreary little bookshop. Uh, it isn't dark and dreary anymore, as most of us will know. I mean,
mm,
it was
mm,
it's really rather good now, and it was rather good then. I mean, actually, in terms of the stock, the book stock, it was better because it had. I was really impressed. It had lots of stuff about different religions in it and different faiths, and lots of stuff about Christianity, lots of stuff about Buddhism. That interested the whole place interested me,
mm, mm.
and I, I I bought six little booklets. Uh, well, a book actually, and five little booklets. I think is probably more accurate. And I've still got them. They're over there on the shelf. I've got a whole list. I've got a whole shelf there of books for newcomers because I'm really interested, and I can remember exactly my process. And so I've been very interested in in explaining, or explaining is the wrong word, talking round Quakerism to newcomers because I remember so clearly how it was for me. And I try to remember what I needed then and try to put it into practice. So I've got these books over there, and there they are, the books I had. The book was a book by George Gorman with a come on title, which is The Amazing Fact of Quaker Worship. A wonderful title, makes you want to go.
Yeah, yeah.
Is this amazing fact? What am I going to find out? What's amazing? What's the fact? I want to know. I want to know. So I read that, and I had advices and queries, and I had a very, very good little booklet by Gerald Priestland called Coming Home, which is fantastic. Um, but there is a but, which is that you shouldn't really give it away too freely now because so much of it is about having been a Presbyterian. that if you give it to a Buddhist or you give it to an atheist or something, they don't
Yeah,
want to know,
yeah.
and who can blame them? But it's very, very good. And there's a bit in it. Oh, I remember reading this before I ever went to a meeting or anything. Um, he says that he was lying on a psychiatrist's couch, his therapist's couch, paying a lot of money to this guy, and he's well, a lot of money then. He wrote it in, I suppose, the 70s or 80s. It's 6 quid an hour, he says. And he said, I suddenly realized that I was discovering on this therapist's couch for 6 quid an hour what I was learning in Quaker meetings every Sunday for nothing, he says. And I thought, well, that's very interesting because I was going to therapy and spending a fortune on it at the time. I was 11 years in therapy because I had to get over that school. But that's that's completely another story. What I did with the booklets, I had these 6 little booklets, and I went to Euston Station and I read them all that afternoon in the cafe there, in the little coffee bar. And I
Yeah.
went back and got another one. And I went that Sunday. I suppose this would have been like a Wednesday or a Thursday that
Hmm.
I got the booklets. And that Sunday, I went to my first Quaker meeting. I was a bit nervous, wasn't sure this was going to be any good. I wasn't sure how much I could believe that stuff that was in those books
Hmm.
about how marvelous this meeting for worship was and how it was this and it was that and it was the other. I was going to a meditation on a Sunday morning at the time, anyway, for something else. Um, it was yeah, it doesn't matter what that was, but it was a I don't know, it was a half-hour meditation or something like that in a community centre. And I was going there. So I had a bit of experience of sitting in quiet. So I wasn't frightened of that.
Hmm.
But I remember sitting on the wall opposite the Quaker Meeting House on the other side of the street and watching them go in. And they had kind faces. And so I made a dash for it. I waited, there was about 30 seconds to go. It was 11 o'clock meeting, and about 30 seconds to 11. I walked very quickly over the road and I walked very quickly up the path and I walked straight in. This poor woman tried to put her hand out to shake my hand, didn't want to know, walked straight past her and sat by the door for a quick getaway. And I've told this story before, but the first meeting, that first meeting was disastrous. I mean, it was absolutely awful. Because there was somebody, and they still have at Hampstead. This was Hampstead Meeting. This was the one that I'd first seen the poster outside. I just
Yeah.
went there because that's where I'd seen the poster. So that's the meeting house. Only one I knew where it was, really. I
Yeah.
didn't know there was one in Friend's house or anything like that. And so I went there and I sat by the door and there was this silence. And then there was a radio blaring just outside the window, really loud. And I was told by a friend from Hampstead Meeting just last week, they still have a problem with this neighbour who objects to people practicing the piano. People hire the place to practice piano or learn piano, or whatever it is. And it's near the party wall with the next door neighbour.
Mhm.
And they occasionally play the radio just outside the window to disrupt things. It's quite intentional. Somebody stood up, must have been an elder, I suppose. Somebody stood up at this meeting and said, well, we're not going to do anything about this at all. We're not going to get this switched off. We're just going to have a meeting. And I learned something about the Quakers because I learned that this was communal, because everyone was sitting there trying to have a bloody Quaker meeting. And we were all doing the same thing at the same time, just sitting there trying to get something done. And we didn't quite. But I thought these people are all right.
Mm.
That's all I thought. That's all. And I left as soon as it was over. Didn't stay for the notices. Sat by the front door. Thank you. Didn't see me the dust. Because I wanted to process it. I wanted to think about it. But I knew before I got to the outside door of the meeting house, I knew I was going to be back the following week. And I was. And I sat there, and that meeting was that meeting wasn't as eventful as the first one. I don't remember anything about it really, but I went back the third week and the fourth week, still left before the notices, still went, just didn't want to stay. I think I was frightened of talking to someone. I think I was frightened of them talking to me because I thought they might try and convert me into something. I wasn't convinced that Quakers don't try and convert people. I'd read that, but
Mm.
I wasn't going to trust it. And so I still wanted to keep processing things. And so I just kept on leaving until, I don't know, about week 6 or 7, when while we were shaking hands, the man who was sitting next to me said, I've seen you here for a few weeks. How are you finding it? And I couldn't leave. So I said the first thing that came into my head, which was, I think it's very odd that there's no spiritual direction here. Because I was used to vicars and things. I'd
Mm.
been to school for the Sons of Anglican Clergy.
Mm. Mm.
And there's lots of things he could have said to that. He could have said, there's two elders over there. You can go and talk to them anytime. Or he could have said, spiritual direction comes from the whole meeting. That would have been true. Both of those things would have been true. Um, but he didn't say that. He gave me the perfect Quaker answer. I said, I think it's very odd there's no spiritual direction. And he said, yes, it is odd, isn't it? And I thought, oh, I'll have a cup of tea. And I've been having the cup of tea ever since. Uh, what happened, what really happened was that I needed a place to sit with this stuff that had happened to me,
Mm.
and a place in which I could, as I thought, still think was necessary for me, a place to give thanks
Mm.
for my
Mm.
life.
Yeah.
And what the Quakers did was they just let me sit there.
Mm.
I was there for week after week after week, and they got to know me a bit, and I got to know them a bit. But what was really happening, as far as I was concerned, was they were letting me sit there. And when I'd been sitting there for about 3 years, I realized I was turning into one of these people. and and they were saying things. I was having trouble with the peace testimony, I remember, which had never been a problem to me in my adolescence. I remember standing up and talking about peace when I was about, I don't know, 14, 15.
Mm.
But as an adult, it had kind of sort of flown out of my head rather. And I was of that sort of standard opinion that it's a dirty job, but somebody's got to do it.
Mm.
And I thought mistakenly, I was wrong, but I thought you had to be a pacifist to be a Quaker.
Mm.
Because I'm self-educated, really. I mean, I've got an education. I went to school and I went to university, but basically everything that's ever been any use to me uh, has been self-education. And so I don't tend to sort of sit at people's feet. I tend to go and research things and look around and see what's going on and read and read and read. And I'd read about peace, but actually I discovered quite a bit later on, quite forcibly, that at that time there wasn't really anything written about the peace testimony for newcomers. Not that I ever found. There were lots of books about how to do it. There, there were lots of books about why, Quakers do this and Quakers do that. Lots of books about the FAU in the First World War, Second World War, Friends Ambulance Unit. Lots of stuff about that, but not stuff about what it is, why you'd want it,
Mm.
what it means for people. Well, there really wasn't anything about that. And much, much later, when I was part of a group who started Quaker Quest,
Mm.
which was the outreach initiative that went on for 21, 22 years before it laid itself down towards the end of the pandemic. At the end of the pandemic, I think that's actually true. We were talking about little books we published called 12 Quakers and this and 12 Quakers and that. And we decided to do one called 12 Quakers and Peace. And I argued, and actually they ended up accepting what I'd said. Not sure I was right, but that's another story. I argued that we should do one called not 12 Quakers and Peace because nobody argues about peace. Nobody thinks peace is a bad idea. Nobody thinks that, you don't want peace. So I argued that we needed to do one on 12 Quakers and pacifism
Mm.
because that's a stumbling block. That because I knew from my own experience that the word pacifism frightens people, and it frightened me, and I wasn't sure I was doing the right thing to join. And so I kind of turned myself into a pacifist, um, really by listening not to Quakers, but to a man who, in those days, was I don't know what he was called, the recorder, the something recorder of the Methodists. He ran the Methodists, basically. He was called Donald Soper. And by that time, he'd been put in the House of Lords. He was called Lord Soper. And I heard him talking. And he said something which I've never forgotten. He said, "There is no such thing as a just war. There are lots of just causes," he
Mm.
said. "But a just cause does not mean there's a just war." And I'd never ever heard the cause separated from the war before.
Mm.
That the cause meant the war, as far as my stupid brain was concerned.
Mm.
And that did it. Just that couple of sentences did it. I thought, oh, yes, oh, that'll do. Oh, blimey. It was such a relief because I knew these Quakers, these people, I knew they'd got something. I remember saying, someone said to me once when I'd been going, I don't know, 2 or 3 months. I remember someone saying, "What are you doing consorting with these people?" And I said, "I think they've got a lot to teach me about being in the world." Because I'd been a bit of a dropout, really. I was in show business. um, Oscar Wilde once said that actors are the opposite of people. and and uh, and, and I think it was Oscar Wilde. Anyway,
Mm.
he also said education is the curse of the acting classes. I know he said that. And anyway, uh, yeah, I'd been an actor, and then I was an entertainer, and I'd been a director, a theatre director. I'd done all sorts of things in show business, but I'd never had a proper job. I've still never had a proper job. I've never had I've never had a wage at the end of the week, unless it was holiday jobs or
Mm.
the job I did between school and university. Um, no, and I mean, yeah, I've got a languages degree. So I was a language assistant at a school in Spain. And I'm very glad that I've lived under a dictatorship, actually. That is
Mm.
a year, that's a year I didn't want to do because it was a dictatorship. And now I am so pleased that I experienced being followed and being frightened and being overheard in bars and being told that I shouldn't have said that because that barman's in the secret police and all this stuff that happened then. Um, Watching people being herded into Black Mariahs, and driven away out of the university, and all this stuff that happened in that year. I'm so glad I've experienced that. But that's the only paid job I've ever had that wasn't, more than a day, really. You just lurch from one nighter to one nighter. Occasionally, you get, a 3-month contract or something. But no, I was not in the world. And I said to this person, the Quakers have got a lot to teach me about being I knew they had everything to teach me.
Mm.
And well, I'm still learning. I mean, the Quakers are wonderful teachers,
Yeah.
and they teach I suppose I should be saying, uh, teach by example, and that's what's so terrific. I,
Mm.
Quakers completely changed my life. I mean, before Quakerism, after Quakerism, absolutely two separate parts. And I changed. I changed over those 3 years. Uh, the first 3 years, I was going to Quaker meetings and sitting with the Quakers and talking to the Quakers and listening to the Quakers. I went 3 times a week because I could, because it was London. And I was going 3 times a week within about, oh, I don't know, 6, 8 weeks, I suppose.
Mhm.
I started going 3 times a week because I really needed it. I knew I needed it. I needed it like, food and water. I just needed it. And I just made extraordinary discoveries. And well, I still do. I'm long in the tooth now. I don't discover as much as I used to. And as I get older, I think I get a bit more dogmatic and stuck in my ways and convinced that this is right and that's not quite right and blah blah blah. I'm a bit of a one for running Quaker meetings properly.
Mm.
Um, but and my idea of properly is not everyone else's idea of properly. But that's all right. I don't, I completely accept that. But so perhaps I'm not learning at the rate that I used to. But yeah, I've devoted the last 22 years, I suppose, is it? Something like that. To learning for myself how to be as articulate as I can be about who the Quakers are and what the Quakers are and what the Quakers do,
Mm.
and talking to newcomers about it and learning how to talk to newcomers and what Quakers, well, not, sorry, what newcomers need to know from Quakers and what Quakers can help them with, which does not mean telling them we've got the answers. It does not mean evangelism. I'm really against evangelism. And somewhere along the last 370 something years, Quakers have confused talking to newcomers with evangelism. And they've said we don't do outreach. Well, I don't do outreach. I hate the word.
Mm.
I try to engage with the public about Quakers. If they want to engage with, not if they don't want to engage with me, I'm not going to. A man came up to me in the street. He ambushed me from behind a pillar. I live in Cambridge, and there are pillars along this street. And he ambushed me, and he said, "Do you love Jesus Christ?" And I said, "No answer to that." And he went, "Oh, yes, there is." And he lobbied me for about 5 minutes, I suppose. And after about 5 minutes, I said, "Actually, look, you go and bother someone else. I'm a Quaker and I'm quite happy being a Quaker, thanks." And he said, "Oh, you people don't believe anything, do you? You Quakers, you don't have any beliefs at all, do you?" And I said, "Oh, yes, we do." And we had a little barney for about a minute and a half. And then I walked away. And he said, "You're going in the wrong direction," which I thought was rather good. And, and I and yeah, I did think then, if you'd had that thrust at you
Mm.
in the street by people, then you wouldn't want the Quakers to be doing that. And I don't want to be. I don't want the Quakers to be doing anything remotely like that. But the idea that there's something wicked about talking about your faith to other people is very strange.
Mm.
A little, dare I say it, selfish.
Yeah.
And I've I've really struggled with all that. I mean, a lot of people have told me on completely the wrong lines. Um, there's an individual person who has been my friend and still is my friend who thinks I'm completely nuts and should never have written a book. I've written 3 books now for newcomers.
Mm.
Um, and one of them has just gone into its 3rd edition because I keep updating it because the Quakers keep updating themselves. So I have to. And I'm I'm not proud of that, and I'm not anything about that. I just had the need to do it. In the end, what happens is that I get an idea to do something, and I think, oh, I'm not doing that. I can't face that at all. No, no. And then a coincidence happens, and someone asks me to do something, and I suddenly think, that's what I just told myself I wasn't going to do. So I'd better do it. And that's what's always happened with the books. I haven't wanted to do the book, and then suddenly someone says, will you draw a book, or will you write about this, or will you think about that, or something? And I end up writing another book. So 3 for newcomers. They've all got different audiences,
Mm. Mm.
but that's all. And it seems a bit daft, really, to have written 3 books about one thing. But but that's what I've done. Just different aspects to it. I mean, once I just overheard a conversation that a newcomer asked an old comer, what do Quakers believe? Could you just tell me what do Quakers believe? And this experienced Quaker said, well, it all depends what you mean by belief. And I thought that is just a scam. And that's ridiculous. That's just pretend. That's just getting out of a difficult question. So I've got to try and answer the question. So I wrote a little book called What Do Quakers Believe? Um, I went home that day and wrote down 35 beliefs that I thought we all shared. They're not all in there. Some of them I don't think were right, but and some of them I've looked at it again, and I think some of them that are in there aren't quite right either. But that's all right. I don't mind that, so long as they've got something to hang on to that tells them something and might get them experiencing. The job is to try and help people to experience a meeting for worship because it lives or dies by that, I think. If people go to a meeting for worship and it's bad, we've only ourselves to blame.
Mm. Mm.
If people stand up and do things that you don't say in meeting for worship and say daft things, just like to say happy birthday to Elsie. If it's that, Elsie's 99 today. Um, if it's one of those meetings, then you don't stand a chance. A friend of mine calls it news, views, and reviews. Quite right. The
Mm.
meeting for worship, there is no place for news, views, or reviews. None. It's got to be what's going on among us with something that is among us, but not
Mm.
tangible, other than through the meeting for worship. So for us, for other people, it's tangible by singing hymns, but not for me. I have to sit there and try to create a stillness, try to stop thinking, try to stop thinking for 5 seconds. It's very, very difficult. But that's the key to me. George Fox said, do not think but submit. The do not think bit feels next to impossible sometimes. But if you've ever experienced, anyone who's ever experienced those few seconds of not thinking when you're suddenly full of something else, then you've submitted. I think.
Mm,
Do not think, but submit. It'll do for me. He said a lot of very good things.
mm.
He was a smart cookie. Very fond of him.
Yeah.
Sorry, you asked a
Oh,
very simple
Geoffrey.
question, and I've just been talking for half an hour.
No, well, that's great because I mean, each individual's journey into Quakers is different, and yet
Yes.
there's something universal in that story as well. And before we talk about some of the other things you talked about, peace, you talked pacifism, you talked about, I'd love to talk more about that experience in Spain. I'd love to get to that. But, and of course, we can talk about your books, but can we go back
No, you don't have to
to
talk. No, you don't have
your,
to talk about
well,
books.
it's not just about you, Geoffrey. It's about what books there are. Anyway, let's come back to what I'm really interested in is how we are formed as people. Okay. And what I'm interested in is this idea that um your generation and mine, I'm in my 50s, had this educational upbringing, which was and a cultural upbringing, which was steeped in Christianity for all its flaws and for all its wonders. Um, I mean, I'm based in Wales and I grew up in Wales, and all of everything we did was steeped in Christianity, and in some ways it still is, and it's just there. I went to a gig the other night by a very famous Welsh singer, David Iwan. Well, everybody knows him now, of course. Yma o hyd with the football song, and still he's talking about Christianity. And the words of even they had a rock band playing there, and even they're using even if it's not Christian language, it's the ideas and the depth and the richness of, community and love and giving to others. And I just worry a little bit that the generations coming now, so young people now and children now who do not have this school, religious education, for example, or assemblies, they're not having a cultural Christian experience. I just worry a bit about that. And I think that for you and I, we've arrived at Quakers formed morally, if you like. And now we're looking for a community to be a part of. And I came to Quakers in my 30s. So what I'm wondering is, have you ever thought about where you were formed morally? And I mean, you're a vicar's son by the sounds of it then.
No, I'm not.
No?
No, no, I'm not. It was a school for the sons of Anglican clergy. My dad was a dry cleaner. But
Okay. So
my,
you went to school with the sons of vicars.
yes, yes, and it was a very, very vicarish education. Very.
Because despite the flaws, I mean, you've hinted at, some, I'm sure there are all sorts of problems and issues around that. But nonetheless, there's something at the core of it, which is a great teaching from a 2,000-year tradition of
Yes,
Christianity.
yes.
And one of the things that I put to the people I'm interviewing is that we throw out that at our peril. And I worry sometimes that we're throwing it out too much. And you've talked just now that you don't like evangelism. I wonder if you've got any response to that.
Well, evangelism is telling people you've got the answers. And we know we don't have any answers. We don't have the answer. Right? And when I was doing Quaker Quest, when I was talking to newcomers every Monday night for 7 years, I would be in there. If I wasn't a featured speaker, I'd still be talking to them, and they'd be asking questions. And the question we got most often, or I got most often, was eternal life.
Mm.
Do Quakers believe? It was couched in different ways. Do Quakers believe I'll ever see my mother again?
Mm.
Was a very, very common way of expressing that.
Mm.
Um, I think people still worry and still engaged by thoughts of that kind and by words like truth. the the warden, not called the warden, called the resident friend of the meeting I was at for 28 years, Hampstead Meeting, and she's still the warden there, told me that when she went to the gym, in the changing room, she used to tell people she was a Quaker if she could. She'd found people would ask her. She's a very good conversationalist, and she said she talked about the peace testimony principally because that means a great deal to people now, whoever you are and whatever you think about religion.
Mm.
And I think I know exactly what you mean because I have a qualm about people not wanting to call this religious. Um, Somebody said once in a letter in the Friend that this should be called the Spiritual Society of Friends, and I thought, well, I'll be the first out the door if that happens,
Yeah.
um, because I don't know what the word means.
Mm.
Absolutely don't know what the word means. I know what religion means, perhaps because of my upbringing and my schooling, but also because of just that word, because I'm a linguist as well. Um, Latin, lig, means bind, means to
Mm.
bind
Mm.
people
Mm.
together. Ligature comes from the same thing.
Yes. Yeah.
So a religion is something that keeps people together. It doesn't mean you have to keep them together because they all believe the same thing, though that's what it's come to mean. It just means keeping things together.
Mm.
And I think that matters. And I think that we shouldn't, the stuff about Quakers we shouldn't be throwing out, which doesn't mean that we renege on the decision that was taken in the 60s and 70s, more or less, in this country among Quakers, that people should be able to join the Quakers if they didn't profess any belief in God or they didn't profess any Christian faith. They could be Buddhist, they could be Muslim. I think that's right. 1936 was it? I think the minute from yearly meeting. I may have got this slightly wrong, so don't take this as gospel fact, but I was told that in 1936 it was the minute from from the yearly meeting in that year, and it might have just been the clerk who wrote this, who knows, that we are open to new light from wherever it may come. Well, if you're going to say that, and we do say it, and it's in advices and queries, so it doesn't really matter if it's 1936, it doesn't
Mm.
really matter if it was one clerk. We now all say it.
Yeah.
It's not very old, that's
Mm.
definite. It's less than 100 years old. We are open to new light from wherever it may come because people didn't believe it until the mid 20th century. Quakers didn't believe that. I don't think they were. This was a Christian, and I still know Quakers who who talk, and I don't blame them because it comes from them.
Mm.
When people say, what do Quakers believe, or whatever the question is, they say, well, Quakerism is a Christian organization. We are a Christian group because their friends are Christians, they are themselves are Christians, and therefore they long for this to be a Christian group, is kind of what they're saying. Um, I don't mind that we have Buddhists, I don't mind any of that stuff. What I mind is that people um, reject what I suppose I have to call kind of goodness, really. That people in the world find something to laugh at in doing good. She's a do-gooder. He's a do-gooder. Doing good is worth having.
Mhm.
Doing good is worth doing. And there was a time, yes, you're absolutely right, when that was completely accepted by everybody. And most people said they were Christians, even if they only went to church once a year
Mm,
or only ever went to church to get married,
mm,
um, which used to be the case for lots and lots and lots of people.
sure.
But they would quote themselves as Christian. I think Richard Dawkins did quite a lot of harm in that respect because he 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 invade, is that the word, I suppose. He talked up um the harm that religion has done
Mm,
and ignored the good that religion has
yeah.
done.
Have you seen?
And the harm that he talked up was massive movements, the Crusades, the all that stuff. Absolutely appalling damage was done by great bands of Christians, all thinking that they were right and killing people who were wrong. Well, it ignores the good that ordinary people do,
Mm,
ordinary neighborly people do all the time. And it's there in people. And I believe this thing of, oh, what's the man's name? Is it Matthew Fox? Who talked about rather than original sin, original blessing,
mm.
that we're all born with an original blessing, blessed inside us, you know. Um, and I believe that to be true. And when I first read, oh gosh, I remember when I first read these things, there is that of God in everyone. Now, a lot of people will tell me now, and I don't use it very often, because a lot of people under 30 find that really obscure. They don't understand it and what it means.
Mm.
In that what? That of God in everyone. That of? What's that mean? Um, Vocabulary changes,
Mm.
ways of expressing things change. So we have to change the way we look at it. I tend to talk about there being a blessing.
Mm.
Everybody is blessed inside them, and they have to work if they're going to ignore it. It's work to ignore to ignore that blessing. And a lot of people go through their childhood um, learning to ignore it.
Mm.
That's what happens.
You see what you were
Sorry, you
just
wanted
saying
to say
about
something.
changing our language for you just said under 30s don't understand that term, that of God. Um, you see
I
what
was, it's a bit general that. I mean,
yeah,
I
yeah, yeah. But I think this is the point that I'm getting at is that when we opened up the society in the 60s and 70s and opened to new light, you can understand that because at that time everybody was rooted in Christianity, as that book by Timothy Pete Ashworth and Alex Wildwood, everybody
open
was rooted in Christianity.
open to
So
new
to
light.
say they were open to new light is a great thing. And obviously I fully understand why that happened and support that happened. But we're in a different phase now. I think we're in a stage where actually the majority of, if you like, the younger half of society are not rooted in Christianity. Culturally, perhaps they are, and they're more Christian than they think they are in the ways of ways they do things and the things they value. But Christianity itself has been pushed out. So to be open to new light, just endlessly open to new light, I don't think that's much of a guidance, you know? And when we're talking about just doing good, well, what is good? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. Do we believe that? I think you've got to decide what is good, what is the right thing to do. So, for example, at the moment, I think progressive politics is getting some things wrong, but they sincerely believe they're doing the right thing. So trying to work out, well, what is the good that we're trying to do has to come from something. And you mentioned Richard Dawkins. Have you seen video. It was about 6 months ago now. It was called The God Debate. And it was a,
Oh no.
you really should watch it because it's an hour conversation between Richard Dawkins and a woman called Ayan, who is she was born Muslim and she's recently she was a big atheist with Richard Dawkins. They became friends and now she's converted to Christianity. Ayan Hirsch Ali, and they have this conversation and it's wonderful. And I really think you should give it some time because in it he alludes to the fact that he recognizes the value of Christianity. She even gets him to agree that he is culturally Christian, and she gets him to agree that he is on Team Christianity, as she puts it. Now, I think these are quite interesting things because when he started his lectures and his ministry, if you like, the world was different from what it is now. And I think there's a vacuum that's happening now. And quite honestly, I think Islam is filling some of that vacuum, that
Yes,
people are looking for
yes.
structure and looking for answers. And because Christianity, amongst the likes of us, is kind of taking a bit more of a gentle approach, other more fervent and strident viewpoints, um, like, for example, the Green Movement, you could even say, all sorts of other political movements are filling that vacuum. So I think, although in the 60s and 70s, Quakers were right to say we are open to new light, it's become a little bit dangerous almost and
Yeah,
vacuous.
I think, well, yes, open to new light of itself, I quite agree with you, tells you nothing.
Mm,
It's the new light that's important. It's what you it's the new light that you bring in and that you start to live with and live for. And it's tricky because in the case of the Quakers, there are all sorts of different strands of belief among us, and the warden, the resident friend at Hampstead Meeting, found a seam in her community of people who were looking for something and would end up being open to the idea that this could be a religious and involve a religious experience, but are brought in. Now, I've always been rather against that because I came in the other route. I came in the religious route. I had to find somewhere to be with this stuff.
mm,
And then discovered that there was more to Quakerism than that. If people come through the peace movement, then we have a lot to live up to because the
mm,
peace movement's marvelous and there's nothing we can teach the peace movement. We can be part of it, but we're not we're not you can't equate us with it. We're not it. So there's much more to us than our social action or our peace work or whatever we want to be doing. Um, but but definitely there are young people under 30, under 40, who are intrigued by the Quakers because they hear about peace and equality and simplicity and truth and sustainability. And I've always been against, until recently, I mean, till the last sort of 2 or 3 years, I've always been rather against putting that first. A lot of people say, can you tell me about the Quakers? And they say, well, it's about peace, equality, simplicity.
mm,
And I've always reacted against that because it seems to me that the bedrock of this is the meeting for worship. And what happened to those early Quakers,
mm,
I mean, it took a long time. They sat in stillness for years and years and years and years and years. And slowly these things came upon them. Equality was very early. Truth was before equality. Truth was the thing that started this whole thing off. Truth with a capital T,
Mm.
equality. And when was the peace declaration? 1661. So we count as our foundation, though it was long before that, really, in a sporadic kind of a way. But we count as our foundation 1652. So whatever year you give it, 1650, George Fox was first called a Quaker by that magistrate.
Mm.
So you can call it 1650, call it 1652, whatever you like. Still a long time before 1661,
Mm.
when based on a letter that Margaret Fell wrote, they constructed a peace statement. And that was only really there to convince the authorities that they weren't going to start a little revolution. They weren't going to try and overthrow the king. So it's interesting. I think this stuff happens through the meeting for worship, but at the moment it seems to be happening the other way round. And there are a lot of people. I mean, the meeting I'm in now, which is I've only been in for 3 years, Jesus Lane meeting in Cambridge. We would get a lot of people, perhaps, wouldn't we? We're a big university town, of
Mm.
course. But it's not just that. There are people coming because they've heard about the peace, the equality, the simplicity, the truth. And I'm interested in that because it's against what I used to think. And
Yeah.
I want to listen and I want to find out what they know. I completely agree with you that by losing the Christian upbringing, in inverted commas, we've lost something.
Mm.
No question about it. We've got to regain it in other ways, and uh,
Because
and, and who
otherwise,
knows, we might.
the testimony, otherwise, the testimonies that we've just talked about, peace, equality, etc., do in the end become a creed if you're not careful.
Oh yes.
They become the starting point, and then people who have not had that deep and profound kind of Christian upbringing that we've just talked about don't quite understand where those, because they're fruits of the spirit, aren't they? You know, they
Mm,
come from a deep experience. And if we're always a little bit cagey about what that experience is, because of modesty, perhaps, we don't want to overdo it. And well, it's much easier to talk about peace testimony than it is to talk about our deep religious experience. I think we're sometimes misleading newcomers and misleading young people as to where these things come from. And no
yes,
wonder then you could end up taking peace. You think, right, well, I've got to think about what peace is and I've got to think about what equality is, and off I go. And as you've just said, it's got to be grounded in some kind of meeting for worship. So
I
let
think
me
so.
ask you this then. What is worship to you? What do you worship?
That's yes. I mean worship. I will come to that, but just as a little digression, I've got a bit of a thing about Quaker jargon, and we are the only people in the world who ever say, "Let's have some worship," without ever saying who or what we're worshipping or defining it in any way. Um, I I pray in there when I get in there, and the first thing I do is thank God for my life because that's what I'm doing there. And the reason I go and the reason I keep going is because I have to be true to that thing that happened to me in my mid 40s, which is still in me somewhere,
Mm.
and I have to be true to it and thank God for it and acknowledge it once a week minimum. I have to be clear that with other people sitting in stillness, I have to do that. Now, I'm not worshipping God in that sense. I'm not doing that. But on the good days, and they aren't always good days, but on the good days, I definitely, for the few seconds at a time, sometimes, minutes, uh, but it's never very long. I get a real sense of something there with me. And that's what I'm going to call worship for the purposes of your question. Um, the testimony, I worry about the word testimony. I do a thing. I don't know if you know about it. Along with some other people, we've started something called Discovering Quakers,
Mm.
which is an outreach initiative, I suppose you could call it, though I don't like the word. Um, and once every week, Tuesday nights, we have an online meeting for an hour with a short meeting for worship, sometimes 10, sometimes 15 minutes. I try to make them 15 minutes now whenever I can, because I've noticed it makes a big difference, that extra 5 minutes. We have a speaker speaking for 15 minutes about his or her life as a Quaker, just their life as a Quaker, just saying who they are and what they do, or anything they want to do, anything they want to do. Um, just talk to those people for 15 minutes. Um, and a lot of questions. And when I talk to those people who are interested in Quakers for one reason or another, I don't use the word testimonies. I talk about principles of activity that lead to principles of action that lead to principles of activism. So I'm trying, I mean, and I don't do that all in one breath. I, I say, I try to explain that these principles of activity will move on to something else. And, and I don't call them, I sometimes say, if you hear people talk about the testimonies, that's what they mean.
Mm.
But I'm never going to defend the word testimony. I know it's the best word for it. I do understand precisely what it means and where it comes from. I know all that, but don't start talking to people about testimonies because it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah.
In conversation, unless you sit and look at its derivation, and it'll take you 5 minutes, even if you know what you're doing,
Mm.
it's pointless. It's daft. You're using words that don't mean anything. And worse, you're using some words that mean other things to the real world. So
Uh,
ministry,
yeah.
we've got to stop doing this.
Mm.
So I'm very much against it, very much against it. And I did do a book, What Do Quakers Believe, has got no jargon in it. Though I think I use worship, I realised that a bit ago. Um,
And it's not just that it's that meanings of words change, is it? Or that meanings kind of outside of our group mean different things. I think it's the fact that you had that experience in your 40s and I had a similar experience in my 30s. There's something about that. I think and the old, the Christian way of thinking about it, that is the Holy Spirit teaches you how to interpret the scriptures. For example, that idea that you can, once you've had an experience, you can then read a story or read the scriptures or listen to a word and think, I understand what that means. And perhaps you before that experience, um, and since you have been able to understand what is meant by peace, and you're interested in exploring peace, for example, in a different way from when you were 25.
yes.
And I suppose what we don't talk about much in Quakers is people who have had some kind of religious experience, which means that they have some insight into these things, and people who haven't had a religious experience. Because, of course, they're not going to understand what we're talking about for those of us who have. Now, that sounds
That's
very exclusive, doesn't it? And you're not going to
well,
like,
I'm wary about talking about it.
I'm
I'm
sure you
wary
are.
of talking about it, and I haven't described it to you. A, because as I said to you earlier, it's pretty much indescribable, I think. But B, because it makes it sound like you've got to have one.
But but don't
But
you
but
have to
do
have
you but
one?
do you think you've got to have one
Well, I
to
think
understand meeting for worship?
having had a religious experience, Geoffrey, it's changed you, and I know it's changed me.
Yes.
And if before we had one, maybe we were talking a load of BS. I don't know. Maybe before we had that religious experience, you and I, let's not talk about anyone else. Maybe we were different people, not focused on quite the same things. And since we've had such a powerful experience, it's changed us. It's changed everything we do. Now, how do
Absolutely.
surely there comes a point when, even though we're very nice people, actually having some kind of judgment about that is a good thing to have.
Yes, yes. But I'm interested in helping people into a meeting for worship, not telling them they've got to go or any of that stuff, but talking in such a way that they think, as George Gorman does in that book,
Mm,
they think, oh, I better experience this. This sounds pretty extraordinary.
mm, mm,
Now, if I say that I had a religious experience and it took me into the Quakers, that means that you've got to have a religious experience to.
mm,
And I know faithful Quakers who've been coming for 40, 50 years and have never had that experience or a similar experience. And they're doing great, thanks, without me, without that, without the experience, without any of that blah that I say. Um,
mm,
so, so I don't think it's necessary, and I don't think it's necessary for me to talk about it or tell people. You asked me what happened to me, so I told you.
mm,
If people ask what happened to me, then I will say something about it. But it was years before I did. It was absolutely years before I did, actually. I was in a retreat group, a sort of little retreat group, and after it, someone said, "Have you ever met anyone who's had one of these releases?" And I said, "Yes, I have. Yeah, it's me." And it was a strange feeling actually, because I'd never really talked about it at all. I'd never really talked about why I ended up there or why it worked for me. It worked for me really more than anything else because I was left alone with my own religious experience. And then I added to it through the Quaker meetings,
mm,
through sitting there. Um, so I've never been one of these Quakers who gets off on process
mm,
and how you run Quaker meetings and all that kind of thing. I mean, I know what I think about that, but it's sort of incidental.
mm,
I'm there for the religious experience. That's what I'm there for. That's why I'm there.
mm,
Um, and you have to, as oh, I've forgotten his name. It'll come to me. As that clever man says, you have to show up. You have to keep showing up.
mm, mm,
Uh, so even in the dry times, even when there's nothing, you're not getting anything, show up. For goodness sake, show up because it does get there in the end.
mm. And I suppose your ministry, if you like, is working with newcomers and talking to newcomers, communicating with those. And and I suppose I'm in a slightly different phase, if you like. I'm aware that as a newcomer, I was very, very enriched by the society. So that what you might call a peak experience, as you called it, didn't happen in Quakers. That was before. That was kind of
Yes,
led
me
to
too.
me
Yes,
needing to be part of a community. And the first 5 years or so in Quakers was very enriching and very nourishing. And I think, as you've just described, for people like yourself working to communicate and to invite and to welcome in, I think it works really well. What I suppose is missing for me, and I think it's still missing, is that deepening of our religious guidance, teaching, spiritual direction, coming back to that opening observation that you had of how odd there's no spiritual direction. And I think as newcomers, you perhaps don't need that or don't want that. In fact, it would be off-putting. But after 5 years, can you see that some people would actually value having a more challenging and something which is routinely talking about religious experience, perhaps in smaller groups, perhaps separate from the meeting for worship, but that the deepening is important as well.
Well, you're right, and you've just given me an idea. So thank you. So yes, perhaps we should be doing that. I'm at a meeting that does a lot actually in terms of uh, little groups of people, little house groups as they're called, um, and there's something that we do once a month, I think it is, called Quaker Essentials, which is for newcomers. I've said I don't like that because it's a sort of top-down word. It's a sort of it makes it
Yeah.
sound like we're going to sort of educate you, which you shouldn't. They should be exploring. Um, and I think it should be called something like Quaker Explorations rather than Quaker Essentials, really. But that happens once a month. I did one on Meeting for Worship just last month,
Mm.
and that yeah, I just led we a few of us do one a year. That's all
Mhm.
that happens. And and yeah, I mean, I get a lot out of I get a lot of I don't know how to express it really. I get a lot of help, quite profound help, as it were, sort of in a religious way, from learning to explain difficult things to people who want to know, but who also find them difficult. And I find I get a lot of help from that. That's part of my religious life. And you're right. I mean, for a long time, I felt guilty that I wasn't going out and doing what you might call social action or whatever
Mm.
those, that kind of stuff that Quakers do. I wasn't doing that, and I'm still not doing it really because every time I sit down, I think of something else I can do to try and spread something about Quakerism
Yeah.
without spreading it, without actually deliberately going out of my way to say, look at this, isn't it lovely?
Yeah.
That's not what I want to do. That's absolutely not what I want to do. The most a group of Quakers can do is stand up, say who they are, and sit down again. That's all you can do because everything else is up to the newcomer.
Yes. And let's just say, so you're a generation above me, okay? And I'm not a newcomer anymore. And I'm fascinated by what you have learned, a generation on from me, what you have learned and what you have experienced, as you say, in your religious life. Now, it might not be your ministry, okay? Because you are very gifted to talk to newcomers, so that's great, and it might not be your work. But can you see how, for someone like myself, I've been a Quaker for 20 years. I'm in my 50s, so I have got some experience, but
For
there
goodness
is
sake, of
still
course you have.
well, but I'm not saying I haven't, but there is still something that I can learn from hearing other people's religious experience. And what
Yes,
I get is a sense of holding back. Like you've just described, I don't want to talk about
yes,
my peak experience too much. So we're holding back from each other. And I suppose that's what I'm wanting to talk through with people is do we accept that that is something that we could loosen up about a little bit, even if it's not for newcomers to listen to, because we don't want to put the newcomers off, and we certainly don't want to stop anybody from joining us who hasn't already had a religious experience. That's the last thing we'd want to do. Nonetheless, there is something that we can say we have found. It's this seekers
yes, there
and
is.
finder,
I'm
isn't
worried. What it isn't quite. I don't think you've quite expressed what the stop in my mind. One of the big aspects of it, because I used to be in show business and I know what I'm talking about, is ego. Now I have to be really, really careful that I never for a second say, imply, suggest that I have opened a door that's shut to other people.
No.
That it's very difficult. If you've ever been on a stage and dominated a room, which I have a lot,
Mm.
I have to with I can do it. I know how to do it. There's techniques for it. I know how to do it. And I have to be so careful that I never ever do that. If I ever think I've done it, I go away with my tail between my legs
Mhm.
thinking, oh God, oh, got that
Well,
wrong. Got that wrong.
yeah.
I it's we all have to be teachable. We have to be teachable.
So
Those of
Jeff,
us who
we
are,
might
in
we might
inverted commas, teaching.
yeah, well, we might have to ban you from doing it then for your own, for because it's a danger to your own soul. But can you see that we might say to people, I have opened a door, and the door is there for you to go through as well.
Yes, oh,
And and
absolutely.
and this is what I feel we're very reticent about. And I don't really understand why. I don't really understand why, for those of us who have found something. Yes, we're still seeking, but actually we have found an amazing thing. And it's not just sitting in silence in a meeting for worship. It's not the sitting in silence. It's that in that you open a door and you go through into something else.
Yes, exactly.
And not everyone does that. And you can see
Yes,
that because they're reading a book or whatever, and that you know that you can see that they're not actually experiencing quite what we're experiencing. And
exactly.
we
No, you're
must
absolutely
talk
right.
about that more.
Yes, you open a door into something that's really fulfilling and extraordinary. And it's from the religious experience, but it isn't of itself the religious experience. It's something else. I completely agree with you. And it's happened to me and it's happened to you and it happens to all sorts of people. I think we ought to just bear in mind what happened historically, actually, which is that from 1652 to 1689, these Quakers were tortured and they were imprisoned
Mm.
and they were left to die because of their beliefs and because they went out on street corners talking about Quakers, just talking about God, talking about religion, and being fervent about it.
Mm.
And they got their comeuppance. They got put in prison. Mainly, actually, we often say it was for this or that or the other. Most of them, it seems to me, were put in prison simply by saying they'd had a message from God. And that was blasphemy. So straight into prison with you. And in 1689, the Act of Toleration, there was another act before it,
Mm.
which name escapes me, a few years before. First one under James II, the second one under um, William and Mary. Um, the Act of Toleration, 1689. And what did the Quakers do? Well, who can blame them? They got left out, they got let out of prison and they all went home. And we're still there. Quakers, the Quakers are still keeping themselves to themselves, which is what they did in 1689 because they weren't going to do all that again. They weren't going to go through all that again. And I think that is still part of our legacy. We don't want to blow our trumpets. We don't want to, the ego comes into it. I mean, blowing the trumpet, all that kind of stuff. We don't want to do that. We don't want to tell people we know something they don't, which is, again, you've implied we do.
I think
Um,
we do. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I don't know. I've always felt that what I've done with my Quaker life that wasn't sitting in Quaker meetings, which has been hours a week, writing, talking, all that stuff about Quakers, has I don't know how far it's got anybody. I've no idea, but I've felt shouldn't I have been, shouldn't I have been an ecumenical accompanier? Shouldn't I have been doing this? Shouldn't I have been doing that?
Mm.
Those things look really worthwhile to me. And yet my push, I end up painted into a corner
Yeah, yeah.
Think by something outside myself, actually, but you can tell me I'm wrong. But I have ended up painted into a corner in which all I can do is write this book, or all I can do
Mm.
is go online and talk to newcomers on a Tuesday night. All those things that I do. And it's just one of those things. I don't know why. I'm just compelled. I just have to do it. And impelled. I don't know. And
Well, we all have a ministry, don't we? And that's,
yes.
it's good that you found yours, really. Well, when you were just talking about, the historical being thrown into prison, and that perhaps being part of our culture, I haven't really thought about that before because it made me think about, cancel culture, which is what we call it nowadays. And then it reminded me of your experience in Spain. And I wonder. What are your reflections now then? What have you learned? You said you were tremendously glad to have lived through that dictatorship
Oh, the
briefly.
dictatorship. Yes.
Briefly. Um, does it make you think about today's politics and about what goes on and what we've just talked about, cancel culture within Quakers? What are your reflections about
Oh, I
that?
mean, the rise. I mean, just see it so clearly. The rise of these men, these strong men. Putin. I saw Franco. He came to the town I was living in, the city I
Right,
was living in.
right.
I saw this man do his Nazi salute. I saw his tanks. I saw the parade of tanks that came in front of him. And I saw, it was 1969, I suppose, or 70, I think it was, 1970. Um, and I went and saw him speak. It was the same. It was a speech that everybody could do. He only had the one speech, and people could join in with it. and, and people at the back were quite sort of satirical, really. And I was amongst a group being quietly satirical at the back. And when he finished, he said, "Viva España!" And his arm went up. And all the arms went up, even the people who'd been cynical at the back.
Mm.
And then something happened that I've never ever seen before or since, except on the films. All the hats were thrown in the air. It was an extraordinary sight. And these men, Putin, Trump, Farage, I fear, Musk, these people, all the names I can't think of now, I've just lost the name of the guy in Turkey, all
Orban.
those people. Yeah, thank you. All those, although they're men, I think all of them are they? I think it's
Well, you
certainly a
have
very
Meloni
male
in
attribute.
Italy as well, don't you? You have
Oh
Meloni.
well, yes, Giorgia Meloni, but she's playing a crafty game, it seems to me. But anyway, um, it's happening. It's happening again. And what Putin did was so reminiscent of 1939, um, as to be beyond eerie. And the way the world's going, I really did think I'd managed to live a life that wasn't besmirched by all this stuff, and I'm not going to. I know I'm not going to. I know we're all going to be in the thick of it in the next. Well, let's hope I've got 10 or more, 10, 20 years more. I've no idea, but
Hope so.
yeah, I hope so too. But if but it's going to be a tricky time. It's going to be a very very tricky time in world history, and I recognise it all. And to live with it, to live as people have done and still do, frightened of the talk, frightened of where they can speak. My daughter lived for 3.5 years in Dresden, which was Eastern Germany, was in East Germany. It's now obviously part of Germany, but is a hotbed of fascism still. And I was talking in a cafe the way I'm talking to you. And
Mm,
my daughter said, "Keep your voice down."
right.
She said, "I'm worried about that guy behind the bar now." And it suddenly all came back to me what it was like to live in that kind of a society, even though, oh no, it had its lighter side. There were odd things that happened, but it was extraordinary, really. You thought it wouldn't be that bad.
But
You
you
thought,
see,
oh
it's
well,
interesting,
I can live a life there.
you're talking about cancel culture now. If you think about in the UK, the things that you can't talk about and the things that police will come knocking on your door for,
Yes,
which is happening now,
yes.
um, is because of of a tweet or because of some kind of post, which is people expressing their opinion, and the police are coming around. Now, this is what people like Farage and Musk are complaining about, and they're trying to push back against it.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that we're a bit muddled at the moment about
Oh yes,
what is the
yes.
cancel culture, and is in the UK. Let's keep focused on the UK. You know that is Farage part of the fascism, which many people seem to think, or is he actually the pushback against, the totalitarian, leftist progressive view, which I think is what he would say.
Oh, I'm sure he would, and I'm sure Musk and all the. I mean, what's the date today? We're recording this on the 20th of December. Yesterday, Elon Musk said that the AfD was the only future for Germany, alternative for Deutschland. I can't speak German, but that anyway.
Yeah.
Um, he said that yesterday. Now, those are the people who were holding rallies in Dresden while my daughter was living there. Um, my daughter lives in France now, which is another kettle of fish altogether. Uh, but unrest is happening all over,
Hmm.
and strong men are saying, "I know what to do about this." All over.
Mm.
Beware of strong men. We have to be very, very vigilant, and and we have to be prepared to stick up for, stand up for who we are.
Because it
And
seems to me that this,
the Quakers have got to do that.
yes. Well,
I mean,
that's what I think the Quakers need to be
yes,
talking about these things, you see, because
yes,
what I hear is a universal distrust of the politics of Farage, and it looks like Musk might be financially supporting
yes,
Farage and all of that. So he is
yes,
relevant, and I read somewhere that Musk seems to think of himself as British in some way. He has a British grandmother, and so in terms of UK politics, I do think Quakers in Britain need to be involved in this and talking about this. And what
yes,
did just happen yesterday is that Quakers in Britain, and along with Woodbrook and along with the Friend, have all left Twitter. And this to me seems short-sighted, you see. I don't think this is the
ah,
right way to go. They have left it and said, oh, well, it's a terrible cesspit of hate, or however they've described it, probably not in those terms. And they've said this is not where we can be, and I just think, but surely we are called to be where there are bad things going on, and we should be there. I mean, I had a look yesterday. The Pope hasn't left. Uh, heck,
well, that's
and
interesting.
you know, so
Uh,
I just think we're
yeah,
misguided at the moment.
I'm not the person to talk to about this because I'm not on any social media at all, and I never have been. Um, and there are circumstantial reasons for that, but they
Mm,
don't apply anymore, and I
no,
don't have
no.
anything to stand on. Uh,
It's just symbolic,
I'm,
though, Geoffrey. I suppose it's symbolic, and I think this is the. I think Quakers don't talk enough about this kind of stuff.
no, I agree.
It
I
is
agree.
it is relevant. Our whole context politically is going to change fairly soon, um, and I don't think we talk about it enough. Um,
Yes,
so
yes.
let me ask you then, what do you think for the future of Quakers? Because this idea for these videos came from the future of Quakerism. What's your final words on the future of Quakerism as you see it?
Um, I'm frightened that we're getting too small to be viable. You don't You don't, I mean, we're losing, well, we were losing sort of between 400 and 700 people every year, members and attenders. Last year, I can't, now I don't have the figure in front of me. I think it was something like 181.
Right.
That I'd be very interested in next year and the year after, because if that continues, even though it's a loss, it does mean something's going on.
Mm.
And the evidence of the meeting I'm at is that people are coming kind of every week now.
Mm. Mm.
It's a university city full of young people. You can give all sorts of reasons for that, but they weren't coming in the numbers before.
Mm.
Um, so I think I'm very hopeful.
Mm.
I think we get a lot of things wrong. Our inability to talk about ourselves, but I would think that, wouldn't I? But our inability to talk about ourselves is crucial. We have to solve that problem. We
Mm.
have to start becoming generous.
Mm.
Generous with our beliefs, generous with the way we are, generous with our meeting for worship. We have to welcome people. Um, when we were doing Quaker Quest years ago, we made an inquiry as to why this meeting had decided not to do any Quaker Quests, because it was quite unusual in that time when Quaker Quest was sort of flavor of the month.
Mm.
Um, and this meeting said, well, we don't have enough chairs. If more people come, then we won't have any seats for them. So it's best not to really. So, but I think that's gone. I mean, I don't think that's the case anymore. That was in the early 90s, I suppose, early to mid 90s, 95, 90. No, I'm wrong. Early 2000s. So 2005, 2006, 2007, that kind of time.
Yeah.
This was happening, and some meetings were doing it, and some meetings were actively not doing it. And I remember one meeting saying we can't do any outreach until we've got our inreach right, which means you'll never do any outreach. So it's just another way of saying it. And so we have to do it. We have to go out and we have to talk to people, and we have to be the people we are when we talk to them, and we just have to be clear and articulate and know what it is we're talking about. If we say things like it all depends what you mean by belief, then we don't stand a chance, not a chance. We'll be gone. I really do believe that.
Mm.
Um, but I'm very hopeful, always, always, always hopeful. And I think things seem to be, there are some tectonic plates, I think,
Yeah.
moving, but I'm not quite sure in what direction, but I think they are moving. Yeah.
Well, that's great. Well, thank you very much for the conversation, Geoffrey. Let's leave it there. And thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you. Pleasure. Absolute pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.